A former Scotland Yard detective got a sinister response when he submitted his evidence to the Parliamentary Banking Commission, and he joins me on the line now. That's Rowan Boswell-Davies. Hi, Rowan, and welcome to Drive Time.
It's great to be with you.
Can you just tell us a bit about your background?
Yeah, I'm a lawyer, actually, by training, but never really fancied it, having qualified. So I joined the Metropolitan Police because of my legal qualifications. I was very quickly sent to Scotland Yard, and I was sent to the fraud squad. So I spent most of my early career as a detective investigating major investment frauds, both in the securities markets but also the futures and derivatives markets. I was at the Yard in all for 12 years. The kind of cases that I dealt with were major investment frauds, people who were being inveigled to invest money in schemes and plans which, frankly, they didn't really understand. But they were being conned. That's the great skill of the con man. They were being conned into believing that they did understand it and were parting with significant sums of money to invest in copper futures and wheat and what we call soft commodities. But really the whole thing was the scams. The futures contracts were never actually ever being bought, and they were being completely bamboozled as to what was happening with their money. Then eventually the wise guys would just sort of come along and say, well, look, we're terribly sorry, you lost all your money, it's a shame, but would you like us to go, because we think we could go back and try again for you. You'd be amazed actually how many people actually did have another go second time round to try and recoup their money, and of course they lost all that as well. It was that kind of stuff I was engaged in.
Now, it sounds to me a little bit like a gambling casino, but even in a casino there have to be rules, and I wonder what the regulation was in the 1980s when you were working at Scotland Yard in the fraud squad.
Oh, there were none. There were none whatsoever. The city regulated itself. The only real controls that existed before the huge regime we've got today, the only rules that really existed were the rules of the club. It used to be said that the city was regulated by the height of the Governor of the Bank of England's eyebrows. That if the Governor of the Bank of England didn't like something, his eyebrows would go up. You would measure his sense of displeasure by how high his eyebrows went. I mean, I know that's a sort of apocryphal story, but in a funny kind of sense, it kind of brings an air of verisimilitude to really the lack of any formal regulatory controls. I mean, there was some control was brought by a pretty feeble government department called the Department of Trade and Industry. But apart from that, if things went pear-shaped, it was generally left to us in the fraud squad to try and sort out.
So the idea really was, are you saying even back in the 1980s, that it was about a company's reputation and a particular dealer, a trader's reputation, that if they had a reputation for losing money, then people wouldn't follow them in the future? Is that about the long and short of it?
Well, in a way, yes, you could say that. But you see, what you're going to realise is that the rules of the city and the way the city plays the game are entirely different for the people in the know as opposed to the people they want to actually take the money from. The way the city regulated itself in many respects was that everybody expected that there would be some skullduggery, and A would steal from B one day and B would steal from A the next day. But as long as nobody moaned and whined about it, and the whole thing was kept within the square mile, within the rules of the club, everybody kind of understood that was the way things were done. But you also went out of your way to look after your fellow practitioners. So that's right, we used to say it was a very clubbable atmosphere. But it was a very different attitude altogether towards the outsiders whom they wanted to attract to become the investors, if you like. Those people never got a fair suck of the sauce bottle at all. But they themselves would never have really known what the reputation of the people they were dealing with who were inviting them to come and invest. Because, of course, the chaps that were doing all this, well, they looked sort of absolutely puckered gentlemen. They looked the real part. They were very sophisticated in their skills in conning people. So I doubt very many losers who actually lost much money really bothered themselves about the reputation of the guy that was offering to look after their money.
So were the fraud squad actually clubbable? Were they part of this little club in the square mile? Because it doesn't sound like there's a lot of room for you.
You're joking. You're joking. No, we were feared. We were absolutely feared in those days. In fact, we got better and better at what we were doing. Once we learned the rules of the game and suddenly started to see the kind of things that were going on. Because you see, in my day, we were part of the new breed that was brought in by Sir Robert Mark to try and clean up the mess that the old Metropolitan Police had been in. There was a time, and I'm sure your listeners will be familiar with it, there was a lot of corruption within the old Metropolitan Police, the old CID back in the 50s and 60s. And Sir Robert Mark brought a whole new breed, a new generation of young detectives into the force to try and make a difference. I was part of that new breed that came in. So we were very keen to show well and to do well. And what we started to do, we stopped playing by the city's rules. We stopped dealing with them as gentlemen, and we treated them as criminals.
So what were the city's rules, though, Rowan?
Oh, well, if you wanted to interview a particular man, you'd ring up his solicitor, and you'd invite him to come in, and you'd say, well, could you please bring Mr. Smith in to see me at the fraud squad in 3 weeks' time? And it was all terribly gentlemanly, because these men were used to being treated like this. They were used to being treated with kid gloves, because there was an immense degree of, in my view, totally misplaced so-called respect for the city types, because there was this concept that they were gentlemen. Well, we stopped playing by those rules. We started treating them the same way we would treat South East London villains. We started kicking their doors in at 4 o'clock in the morning and dragging them back to Holborn Police Station and locking them up in exactly the same way as we would treat any other respectable villain. And it had a remarkable effect, because we started charging them, instead of dealing with them in the way the old DTI used to, having long drawn-out trials arguing about how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. We started charging them with ordinary offences of theft and false accounting and obtaining property by deception, old criminal offences under the Theft Act. And they absolutely hated having that done to them, because what it meant was that when they were convicted, it meant that they were completely cast out of the city. They couldn't go back, because they were now marginalised as being criminals, and they could never actually go back to their old stamping grounds again. And so there was actually, for a period of time, there was a great deal of fear on the part of a lot of these people. In fact, I'm not sure whether you're familiar with a case called the Blue Arrow case.
Yeah, we were discussing it last week, yeah.
Oh, well, sorry, there we are. I'm right behind you then. Well, in the Blue Arrow case, that was a case where some really blue-blooded city bankers, I mean, these guys were right out of the top drawer, and they were prosecuted for one of the old-fashioned city offences of a form of market manipulation, and they were convicted. Lengthy trial, but they were convicted. And the effect of that upon these princes of the city was that suddenly overnight their reputations were literally pulled from underneath them. I think, frankly, society, I think the establishment was so shocked that this could happen to them that they almost rushed into an appeal process which was so unusual by the terms of the time, because what they did was they allowed their appeal. Normally when an appeal goes forward, the only thing that a defendant can appeal against, he can appeal against the way the judge summed up to the jury, he can appeal against the interpretation of the law. What he can't appeal against is the fact the jury found him guilty, because the juries are the finders of fact. But what happened in the Blue Arrow trial was that they actually found that the jury could not have come to a reasonable verdict because of the length of time the trial had taken. And for me, that was unheard of at the time. But when it was all over and when the dust had settled, a friend of mine from the Serious Fraud Office, a very close friend of mine at the Serious Fraud Office, rang me up. And he said to me, he said, well, mate, that's it. The message has come down from on high. We're not going to have any more major criminal trials against the blue bloods in the city because it's all too embarrassing. They just can't cope with it. And so we've been told in future, these kind of trials, we're just not going to have them anymore.
When you were kicking people's doors down, did you find that they kicked back at the time?
It took them some time to get used to the fact that there was a squad of detectives who weren't prepared to pay them the kind of respect that they felt they were owed. But the pushback, I think the pushback really came when because the people we were dealing with were not, it has to be said, were not as socially elevated as the blue bloods in the County Nat West case. So I think that was what really shocked the establishment back in the 90s. But and there was a very definite pushback as far as the establishment was concerned. And of course, you see, what you must bear in mind is that by the time the Blue Arrow trial came on, of course, the city then had created a whole form of convoluted so-called self-regulation. And we'd been through the era of Big Bang when all the rules changed. So that now we theoretically had a whole regime of regulatory conduct in the city, which was supposed to make things better. I mean, it didn't. Everything carried on in exactly the same way. But it was supposed to make things better. So really and truthfully, I think one of the reasons they felt confident that they could say, well, we're not going to have any more of these kind of trials, is because the establishment felt that they had now implemented a regime of financial regulation which should be given a chance to work properly.
At the moment, there's this Parliamentary Commission on Banking, which has been taking evidence on banking culture, and I understand you submitted some evidence to that, and you got a frosty response.
I have a very, very, very strong belief that the only way you can really regulate, particularly in an environment like the city where they're dealing with other people's money, the only way you can regulate that is if you find people are stealing that money, then regardless of how they see themselves or their class, you deal with them as potential criminals. And you deal with them in exactly the same way as you would deal with them, say, they were robbing post offices or mugging old ladies in Brixton or Clapham or Peckham or whatever. And that's always been my view. I've always taken the view that there should be no social distinction between people who commit crimes in the streets and people who commit crimes in the suites. Because I've been watching what's been going on in the sort of whole of the financial regulatory arena and becoming thoroughly disgusted with the way in which the Financial Services Authority seemed to be completely incapable of actually doing anything about locking up any of these people who were openly committing criminal offences. So I decided to submit evidence to the Commission on Banking Culture. And what I said to them was that we had whole sectors now of the British banking community which were behaving in ways which were synonymous with organised crime. And I said, we've got areas of banking which are nothing more than organised criminal activities.
Right. I mean, how do you stand a statement like that up?
It's very simple. I use 4 definitions of organised crime which are accepted globally. I use the American model, I use the Australian model, I use the European model, and I use the British model. The definitions of organised crime. And then I looked at the activities of, for example, I mean, what people talk about, they call about mis-selling, PPI mis-selling.
Yeah, the payment protection insurance, which was designed to make sure that if you maybe lost your job, you could continue payments.
That's right. Well, what was happening there was that the banks were openly selling products to their clients that they knew full well they could never, ever use to protect themselves. They knew that, but they carried on selling it. Now, if you induce somebody to part with money to buy an insurance policy from you, and you know full well but it will not do the very thing you tell that person it will do when you sell it to them. It's a crime. It's a straightforward offence under the Theft Act.